It's me, thinking out loud. I've been thinking about a moment that felt small while I was in it, and then stayed with me longer than I expected. It was my first no code application, an MVP technically. And even that word is part of why the moment keeps catching my attention. Because I talked recently about how easy it is for something to look ready before it actually is. This fit that pattern a little too well. The first version looked good. Clean interface, steady flow, no obvious friction in the places I was watching. It performed well enough on the surface that I could move through it without feeling the structure underneath asking for attention, which, honestly, is part of what makes these tools so persuasive. They let the visible layer settle into place quickly, and once that happens, your brain starts relaxing in ways it probably shouldn't. I showed it to the client, and I was clear with them. What we were looking at was a prototype. That mattered to me because I didn't want the first version carrying more certainty than it deserved. Still, their response was immediate. They felt it was right. Not just promising, right. Ready to move forward. I didn't challenge that. I'm not even sure I had a reason to in that moment. From where they were sitting, the thing worked. It looked finished enough to trust. And from where I was sitting, I could feel that familiar pull to keep going while the momentum was good. That's the part I want to leave intact because I don't think anything deceptive happened there. The demo wasn't fake. The response wasn't irrational. The early version really did what it needed to do, at least in that first frame. It solved enough of the visible problem that continuing felt reasonable. And I think that matters to say plainly. Sometimes when people tell these stories back, they rewrite the beginning so the ending makes more sense. They make the early confidence sound naive, or they insert warning signs that weren't actually clear at the time. I don't think that's what this was. It was more ordinary than that. The application looked polished. The client responded positively. I moved into development assuming we were extending something solid, which is, I guess, how a lot of these moments begin. Not with disaster, not with obvious error, just with a surface that holds well enough to invite commitment. And maybe that's why I keep connecting it back to the larger thing I've been noticing with MVP language and with no code more generally. The gap between what something looks like and what it is can stay hidden for a while. Not because anyone is lying necessarily. Sometimes the interface is simply smoother than the thinking beneath it. Sometimes the first version really is useful and still not settled. Sometimes working only means the visible layer hasn't been asked a hard enough question yet. At that stage, though, none of that felt dramatic. It just felt like progress. The client was pleased. I had something tangible. The next step was obvious: build out the rest of what the application would need in order to support more features. So I left the demo behind and moved into the deeper work, the part nobody sees when they're deciding whether something feels ready. That next phase had less to do with screens and more to do with structure. The backend needed to expand. The data organization had to support additional features we hadn't needed in the first version. And that's usually where the mood changes a little for me, anyway. The visible part of a system can be encouraging. The underlying structure is where the real commitments start showing up. So I was in that layer, adjusting, extending, trying to make sure the application could grow without becoming unstable. And I was using AI as part of the process. That's not unusual for me now. I use it to reduce friction, to move through possibilities faster, to pressure test directions. But I don't usually confuse that with trust, or at least I like to think I don't. I hadn't been heads down coding in years, not really, but no code drew me in anyway. And then I had to put on my big girl pants and learn how to code in the language of the tool I was using. So when I say no code bullshit is exactly that, I mean it from inside the work. In this case, the system was directing me toward changes in the data structure, specific changes. Reorganize this, connect that differently, shift the underlying model so the next features could sit on top of it. On paper, or maybe not even on paper, just in the way it was being presented back to me, it had that polished authority these systems often have: clean logic, forward motion, a kind of confidence in the answer. And almost immediately, something in me registered that it wasn't right. Not as a thought at first, as a jolt, a tightening, the kind of internal resistance that shows up before language does. Not loudly, not in a fully articulated way. I wasn't sitting there with a complete alternative design all laid out and proven. It was quieter than that, more like recognition than analysis. Just no. Something about that shape doesn't make sense. I remember pushing back on it, at least internally, then externally, then again. I told AI it was wrong more than once. I restated the requirement. I pushed back on the shape of it. I challenged it because the thing it was insisting on felt off in a way I couldn't ignore. But the direction kept coming back in some version of the same form. And I kept hovering in that space where I knew I didn't agree, but didn't quite hold my ground either. It was frustrating. It was one of those moments where you can feel yourself being talked into your own doubt. I went with it. That's really the center of it. I went with it even though I felt the misalignment. Not because I was convinced exactly, more because I let the system's fluency create just enough doubt in my own judgment to keep moving. It's a strange kind of acquiescence, not wholehearted belief, just a subtle handoff. Maybe it knows. Maybe I'm being too rigid. Maybe the faster path is also the better one, something in that range. And speed does have its own pressure. Convenience does too. When something presents itself as an answer, especially in a development flow where you're trying to maintain momentum, stopping can feel disproportionate. It only feels slightly off, and slightly off is easy to negotiate with, easy to override, easy to postpone. So I kept building in that direction, not dramatically, just steadily, one change leading to the next, the way these things do. And for a while, it still looked like progress, because you can go a fair distance on the wrong structure before the wrongness fully reveals itself. That's part of hidden complexity, too. The consequences don't always show up where the decision was made. They show up later, downstream, after the commitment has already hardened a bit. Eventually, it became clear that the direction was wrong, and not in a subtle way anymore. We had to back out of where I'd gone in order to get where we actually needed to be. Undo the changes, return to what I had recognized earlier, rebuild from there. It was inconvenient, yes, but even that isn't the part that stayed with me most. What stayed with me was that I had already known enough to hesitate. I think that's the distinction I'm still sitting with. This wasn't really a story about not knowing. I did learn things in the process, absolutely. There was value in tracing the mistake, in seeing more clearly why the structure needed to hold a certain way. But underneath that, there was another truth that was harder to ignore. I had recognized the problem early, and I moved past my own recognition anyway. That part is messy, human messy, not tidy logic, not clean certainty, just instinct, memory, pattern, resistance. AI doesn't have that. It can generate confidence, but it doesn't have the body of experience that tells you when something is slightly off. Maybe that's where we need each other, or at least where the limits become obvious. So when I think about judgment in that moment, it's less about whether the AI was wrong. Systems will be wrong. That part doesn't shock me. What catches my attention is the smaller, more personal thing, the gap between noticing and acting. The difference between sensing misalignment and treating that signal as meaningful enough to stop. I've spent enough years around systems to know when the shape of something feels off. Not always with full proof in hand, not always with elegant language ready, but experience does leave traces in you. Pattern recognition, structural discomfort, a kind of internal resistance that appears before the explanation does. And I think in that moment, I overruled that because the output sounded coherent and because the path it offered was immediate. And maybe because the surface confidence of the tool made my own uncertainty feel less valid than it actually was. That's not a dramatic confession. It feels more ordinary than that. Maybe that's why I'm paying attention to it. These aren't always big betrayals of judgment. Sometimes it's just a slight softening, a willingness to proceed even though something in you has already leaned back. And that's the strange part. Humans are still running on instinct, pattern, and memory, while AI is still trying to complete the shape of what it thinks we want. There's value in both, but they are not the same thing. Maybe that's the point I keep circling. Not that one replaces the other, but that both fail differently. And I can see how it connects to the broader pattern I've been circling lately, the hidden complexity under no code, the way MVP language can make early things feel more stable than they are, the way polished output can borrow credibility from its own presentation. This experience didn't prove some grand point for me. It just made the pattern feel more lived in, more specific. I'm not especially interested in turning it into a lesson. It's more that I keep replaying that moment where the suggestion appeared and something in me said no, quietly, but clearly enough, and I kept going. Not because I had no judgment, maybe because I didn't trust it quite enough in real time. I notice that now, or I'm trying to. That very small threshold where something only feels a little wrong, and that makes it easier to ignore than if it felt fully broken. I think a lot sits there actually, in the slightness of the signal, in the part that isn't forceful enough to make a scene, but is still present. Anyway, I'm still watching that. Not the error exactly, the moment before it. The point where something in the shape of a decision doesn't sit right, and I know it, and I move anyway. I'm still thinking out loud.